This'll look cool on DVD.
The utter amount of pure greatness that this show exudes never ceases to amaze me, everybody. But anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to actually another video relating Spider-Man, the new animated series. So yes, we are once again back discussing the underrated gem that is SpiderMan Tenacity. And if you are someone who is a bit unclear as to why we are doing so, you should probably check within the previous video I did on my channel. Basically, Mainframe Entertainment, who is the main developer behind the series all the way back in 2003, have recently expressed interest in creating a second season of the show. However, the primary factor as to what's stopping them from doing so is the fact that Marvel themselves would need to greenlight the project in order for it to get underway. Now, of course, I'm sure that there is a majority of you who definitely want to see another Spider-Man cartoon be revived instead of this one, like that of the 90s show, or of course the utter masterpiece that is Spectacular Spider-Man. But as it stands as of right now, the closest thing that we do have to a fully standalone Spider-Man cartoon being revived in a completely new format, as well as featuring polished animation quality, and even going so far as to feature a mature tone to actually provide much more adult themes and stakes to the story as a whole, that would of course lay into SpiderMan Tenacity. And seeing how wonderfully the majority of you responded to my previous video going into the show in depth, I'd figured I'd take it a step further by going over the top 5 best episodes that the series had within Season 1. One of the main reasons why SpiderMan Tenacity Season 1 stands out so much to me compared to any of the other Spider-Man cartoons out there as to how much of adult-centered themes they focused on in each episode. Not to mention that they were actually willing to take risks by implementing brand new characters that were never introduced in previous Spider-Man lore directly within the show's continuity. And even if by some miracle we actually end up receiving a second season of this show later on down the line, the problem is that they might have to turn down the levels of intensity within the theme that the show might convey. This is mainly for a couple of reasons, primarily due to the fact that this show was actually created before the massive Disney and Marvel merger occurred. But the biggest factor out of all of them as to why the show was able to go so dark was because of how it was debuting on MTV at the time. Even though the show was promoted to convey a much more youthful vibe to a younger audience, it managed to get away with a lot of suggestive themes such as violence, death, and sexual activity. I mean, this show was so intense that they actually managed to get away with putting in a decapitation in a Spider-Man cartoon. And if that doesn't tell you how dark the show could get at times, then I don't know what else will. But because of this much darker theme that the show actually ends up enveloping, this actually turns it into one of its biggest strong suits. Without the overall tone that Tenacity has, we probably wouldn't have gotten some of the most well fleshed out episodes that this series had to offer in their entirety. And if anything, the level of seriousness and maturity that each episode conveyed left an even bigger impact when dealing with each specific character that was featured in each individual episode. Rather than having continuous arcs be thoroughly showcased throughout the series, it instead feels like individual one-offs focusing on new characters per episode. But at the very same time, each episode does a phenomenal job by thoroughly showcasing the inner struggle that Peter faces with his duality as himself as Peter and as Spider-Man. Not only does this keep the character extremely relatable to the audience members in more ways than one, but it also showcases different types of struggles that Peter may face throughout the series. And seeing how Peter goes about handling each situation, either in a more normal way as Peter or a more superhero way as Spider-Man, that's one of the biggest draws of the show as a whole. And in my personal opinion, no other episode does this better than the number 5 pick on my list, with that of SpiderMan Disabled, also known as the Silver Sable episode. The amount of stakes that this particular episode showcases are set up almost instantly. Having Peter accidentally be involved within a political assassination attempt is just something really interesting to see within a Spider-Man show. Alongside of that, you also get some incredible chemistry between the main cast and the newcomer member of the group with Indy. And seeing the massive love triangle aspect between MJ, Peter, and Indy thrive even further within this episode is just something really funny to see play out. But of course, just seeing Silver Sable be portrayed in such an interesting way within this episode, as well as having it feature some of the most incredible swinging animations within the entire show, is just a blast to see on screen. And even though this can easily be said for all of the episodes on this list and the show as a whole, the voice acting talent that this show portrays is just a true highlight of the entire series. Primarily in the case of Neil Patrick Harris as Peter Parker, he can instantly switch from being a bit more meek and level-headed as Peter to being a bit more mature and serious as Spider-Man on a dime. And while this show truly is great on a plethora of different levels, I don't think it would have been carried as far as it was if not for this talented voice cast. And all of those attributes and more are carried even further within the series within my number 4 pick with the episode called Keeping Secrets, also known as the Talon episode. Now, even though Talon is clearly this universe's version of Black Cat, I just really appreciate what the writers did with creating Cheyenne's character much different than that of someone like Felicia Hardy. And instead of having Cheyenne's character revolve around more towards Peter, the writers actually did a little bit of a switch and had her connect more towards Harry Osborn. Throughout the majority of this episode, we continuously see the bonds grow between Spider-Man and Talon as well as Peter and Harry. And due to the fact that Peter is fully aware of Cheyenne's double life as the Talon, this creates a whole lot more stress for him to deal with as both Peter and Spider-Man. But another aspect as to what makes this episode so great is that we do get to see Peter slowly start to bond with Cheyenne on a personal level as friends. And even more so, given how important that Cheyenne is to Harry, Peter is trying to do everything in his power to actually try and convince Cheyenne to stop her criminal deeds in order to live a normal life. I truly believe that this is one of the many episodes within this series in which it fully embraces the mantra of where when Peter Parker wins, Spider-Man loses, and when Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses. Because at the very end of the episode, while it may appear that Spider-Man is triumphant by stopping Talon and her criminal robberies, it doesn't look like Peter got through to her by trying to convince her to stop the life that she is leading and also leaving Harry out of a relationship. So while this episode may end on a more somber note, I just heavily appreciate the amount of maturity and complexity it dives into on a personal and emotional level. And funny enough, that can also be said for the third pick on my list with that of Tight Squeeze, also known as the Pterodax episode, and also the first appearance of one of the best characters of the show with Indy. Now, the biggest highlight of this episode in particular is actually the fact that it rarely focuses on Spider-Man, and instead more so focuses on the heroics that Peter Parker can do as just his average everyday self. The overall scenario that Peter essentially finds himself in during this episode is pretty much the purest definition of being between a rock and a hard place. Primarily, the local news station that Peter frequents and where Indy works has been taken hostage by Pterodax. Now, this situation could be easily remedied by someone of Peter's caliber if he actually wasn't one of the hostages themselves. And due to this predicament, it really keeps the viewer on the edge of their seat to see how Peter is actually going to find a solution to this problem. This episode also does a really great job of showcasing the pure intellectuality that Peter holds as an individual outside of the costume itself. Plus, it's always a standout moment within this show whenever we actually get to see Peter do some Spider-Man action whenever he's not wearing the costume directly. And thanks for this episode introducing Indy, because we definitely get a lot more of her showcased throughout the series after her initial introduction. Plus, the romantic chemistry that Peter and her have is just top tier quality. Now, as we come to the conclusion of this list, it was pretty hard for me personally to differentiate between which episode I think should be number 2 and number 1. But in the end, I do believe choice number 2 had the most emotional impact out of all the other episodes within this series, but episode number 1 just had the best presentation and the overall best qualities of the show in its entirety. But to start off with number 2, I am of course talking about The Party, which is obviously one of the best representations of Electro which I've personally ever seen in any form of Spidey media. In my personal opinion, this version of Max Dillon is essentially what the Amazing Spider-Man 2's version of the character was trying to be. Max is an extremely sympathetic and relatable character within the show because he just wants to get along with everyone in school, but sadly he is a massive victim of bullying. And even though we do end up receiving a really great and visually pleasing superpower beatdown by the end of the episode, you almost don't want to see them fight due to how much you care about Max. And clearly, the writers must have thought that this episode was a hit too, considering the fact that they featured Electro in another episode down the line titled When Sparks Fly, which was pretty much meant to serve as a part 2 to The Party. In reality, the main message of this episode is really trying to convey the pure cruelness that human nature can convey from time to time, especially if they are picking on a weaker individual. And just knowing during the final battle of this episode that we do end up seeing Peter as Spider-Man trying to sympathize with Max Dillon as Electro, telling him that he knows exactly how it feels like to be picked on and bullied, it's just another reason which greatly showcases all the potential that this show could have if it were to be revived for a second season. But finally, as we move on on to the last pick, or should I say my first pick on this list, is actually none other than the Lizard episode of Law of the Jungle. This is without a doubt one of the most suspenseful and thoroughly layered episodes that I've ever seen within any Spider-Man cartoon that's been made thus far. Not to mention that this version of the Lizard is just downright savage and immensely awesome to look at. And out of all the other episodes that were featured within the show, this one is easily the most influenced by the first Raimi movie all the way back in 2002, considering that this series was supposed to be a loose adaptation of that film. While short, the overall connection that Peter Parker and Kurt Connors share with one another in terms of being passionate about science really goes a long way once you do understand where Kurt is coming from. And given how Doc Connors actually does die by the end of this episode in a pretty gruesome way, it just shows how much Peter was actually trying to save him when he was fighting him as the Lizard. And furthermore, the overall score that this episode holds truly adds more depth and layers to the Lizard being the standout character of this particular episode. So if we by any chance end up receiving any awesome episodes like these in a potential season 2 of TNAS, I would just be through the roof excited and crossing my fingers for more in the future. But with all that said, everyone, those are my personal top 5 picks for the best episodes within Spider-Man the new animated series, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. Out of all the episodes that were featured for Spider-Man TNAS in the show's first season, which one stood out to you the most and how would you rank them personally? Now, if you are someone who just can't get enough of this show, I highly recommend to check out the amazing collab I was lucky enough to be a part of with my fellow friend Saber King over on his channel, which I will leave as a link in the description below. Again, this show definitely deserves more credit where it's due, and hopefully after watching this video, you get an even bigger perspective as to what made this series so special in the first place. But until next time, everyone, thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to put the hashtag BringBackTNAS out there if you are someone who really wants to see this show possibly return, and furthermore, peace out.
Got it. Moving on.